Well, good morning, Greatview friends. Thanks for joining us on this fifth Sunday of Lent, this time of preparation for the triumph, the trauma, and the victory of Holy Week, just a couple of weeks ahead of us now. This past week, we had the first official day of spring here in St. Catharines, and apparently that means we're experiencing springtime here. I took this picture in our garden just outside our building this week. Doesn't exactly look like springtime, does it? Kind of gray, dirty, dusty, dried out, no signs of life. We might say these are the leftovers of winter hibernation. Now, you've seen me project this image week after week throughout the winter. Those cold, dried out grapevines. Everything looks dead, doesn't it? But that's not really the truth, though, right? Well, I guess it's one part of the truth. It is cold. There's the leaves, the branches are dried and dead. But the vine, the roots are still alive beneath the cold ground. And that's the truth of Jesus' statement. If you remain in me and I in you, even during the times when it seems like not much is alive, you will still bear much fruit. That statement from Jesus are the words that he spoke to the disciples at the Last Supper, the evening before he was crucified. This time tomorrow, it's going to look like I'm dead, that everything is finished. But remain in me, and I will remain in you. Do you remember what happened after the supper? They went out to the Garden of Gethsemane. Judas betrayed him. Jesus was arrested. The disciples fled away, and a bit later, Peter denied that he even knew Jesus. Not really good examples of remain in me. A dead garden? Maybe, but it really all depends on where you're looking. It's about perspective, we might say. Well, that's been our focus these past couple of weeks. In which direction are we looking? The woman at the well was in a relational crisis. The man born blind was in a lifelong physical crisis. And then God showed up and everything changed in their lives. Now, I don't think that woman found the perfect relationship and everything turned out happily ever after. That man who was no longer blind was going to have to relearn how to live as a seeing person. Wouldn't be an easy life ahead. But now they had experience with a God who showed up, concerned about the details of their lives. And so our story for this week, this man who gets sick and dies. Now that's a crisis. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it's for God's glory so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days and then said to his disciples, "Okay, let's go back to Judea." Now, this is interesting, or perhaps confusing. This sickness won't end in death. That was Jesus' first response. No, this is a situation where God will be glorified. If you think about it, it's very similar to his response to the man who was born blind. This situation is for God's glory to shine through. That's what he said. That's what he had said about the blind man. But then Jesus just sits there for 2 more days. Now, just because someone is sick doesn't mean that Jesus hops up to take care of it. We've seen this elsewhere in Jesus' ministry. He's waiting on the right timing from the Father. And then he says, let's go. Time to go. Well, where are they going? To Judea, to Jerusalem. The disciples chime in. But Rabbi, they said, just a short while ago, the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you're going back? Well, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up. His disciples replied, well, Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So on the one hand, someone wants Jesus to leap up and take care of this sick guy. On the other hand, his disciples want to avoid the criticism of the religious leaders in Jerusalem. They're actually afraid of going back to Jerusalem. Jesus says, nope, this is the right time. Whatever we face, a sick guy, a dead guy, our own deaths, this is now God's time. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let's go to him. Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, okay, let us also go so that we might die with him. Can you just see the confusion on the disciples' faces? What? Lazarus is dead now? How did you know that he was dead here where we are? And Jesus is just kind of, oh my goodness, you guys, will you ever understand this? And we have good old Thomas the skeptic. Okay, so we're just off to die with him in Jerusalem, are we? Now, when Jesus got to Bethany, it turns out that Lazarus has been dead and buried for 4 days already. It seems a lot of people were standing around for those mourning days with the 2 sisters. Bethany, this village, was just a short distance, kind of on the outskirts of Jerusalem. And so friends were coming and going from the city, and they heard that Jesus was on his way, so Martha goes out to meet Jesus. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha answered, well, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day. It's interesting that it's Martha who comes out to speak to Jesus. She's confident that Jesus could have healed him. Whatever Jesus can do now, she doesn't know exactly, but she knows that God acts whenever Jesus asks. Jesus said to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. So here we have one of the most significant conversations in all of Scripture. This interaction of life and death and belief in the power of God to deal with those things as God sees fit. Believing that Jesus is the Son of God, the Messiah, is the way to life, even if we physically die. And if we live believing in Jesus as the Messiah, the one sent by God, Our physical death is just a passing from one form of life to another form of life. In chapter 21, John says that the reason he wrote this gospel is so that his readers might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing in him they might have life in his name. And this woman, Martha, is the one who makes that most unequivocal declaration. Jesus is not a spiritual guru or a faith healer or some social justice warrior or a trauma therapist. Jesus is God, the source of all life. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, this is the other sister, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "Do you see how he loved him?" Jesus is the resurrection and the life. He is the Messiah, the Son of God. He's also the one who enters deeply into our sorrow and pain. He was deeply moved, it says. He was troubled. He was weeping. Yes, he loved his friend Lazarus and experienced that pain. But we also understand that Jesus was entering into the pain and the brokenness of death and dying for all of humanity. That's the reason that he was about to encounter his own suffering and death. Jesus was, in a sense, experiencing firsthand with the death of a close friend the evil of death amongst those he loved. This is what Jesus came to do, is to destroy, to win the victory over death. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he's been there 4 days." Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I know that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of these people standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." I love this little conversation God has with his Father. I know that you had this wrapped up days ago when we first spoke about Lazarus. But let me just pray out loud today so that these folks around here can hear me and believe. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" And the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Therefore, many of the Jews who'd come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. This resurrection of Lazarus. Now, these are the kinds of things that the Jewish people were expecting the Messiah to do. And so it says, many people believed. But the religious leaders weren't convinced. So they started the proceedings that would eventually lead to Jesus' death in a few days. Lazarus was sick. His sisters were in despair. Call for Jesus. They were in crisis mode. And then they waited. I wait for the Lord. My soul waits, and in his word I hope, said the psalmist that we read this morning in our service. And then in Jesus' own time, God shows up. It was clear to all that day that God had done this. A dead body rotting for 4 days is resuscitated. Now that's a God thing. I want us to reflect for a moment on some dead bodies in the Old Testament. Ezekiel and the Valley of Dry Bones. God shows the prophet Ezekiel a valley of dry bones and asks, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel's very diplomatic, talking to God. "Sovereign Lord, you alone know." And then he said to me, "Prophesy to these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life." Then he said to me, "Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up, and our hope is gone, we're cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. My people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord, when I open your graves and bring you up from them. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live. I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken. I have done it, declares the Lord. Israel was defeated. The Babylonians had literally created a valley of dead bodies in Judea and around Jerusalem. And now, decades later, they were just dry bones there. Ezekiel himself lives in exile as a captive in Babylon with those who weren't killed in that defeat. Israel is a nation in despair, in crisis. Our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. And then God shows up. Israel waited decades before they were able to return from captivity to their own homeland. But they did. Israel has waited centuries for Messiah to show up and raise dead bodies. Now Martha has just declared to us that this man, Jesus, is the Messiah, the one we've been waiting for. What's so clear in this Ezekiel passage is that God is the one who's going to do everything. Israel's task in captivity was to return their hearts to trust that God would deliver them, to wait in hope-filled belief that God would deliver them. And as they learn to trust, God shows up. Martha, do you believe that I am the resurrection and the life? You'll note that she says yes to Jesus before her brother is raised from the dead. Her experience with Jesus already up to this time has led her to believe this. She knows that Jesus can do whatever he sets out to do. This miracle resurrection was beyond her trusting, obedient imagination. It was more than she could imagine. This was a kind of gift from God, something God wanted to do. Her brother's resurrection was not something she had demanded from God. But this resurrection of Lazarus was also a sign, a foreshadowing of what was about to happen to Jesus himself. this huge miracle of a dead body resurrected apparently did not mean anything to the disciples just a few days later. They fled, they were in despair, they feared for their lives, while Jesus' body lay in the tomb. Except, it tells us that a few of these women stood around, wondering. Something for us to think about. As we prepare our hearts for the coming Holy Week, as we journey with Jesus, when he's first of all celebrated as King of Kings entering Jerusalem, to his arrest, to his suffering, to his death, we're reminded that death does not have the last word. That resurrection is promised. Resurrection is experienced in the midst of pain, threat, and death. Jesus did not shy away from the threat of death. Thomas wanted to avoid Jerusalem. Jesus walked toward Jerusalem. Jesus offered himself freely as the one who brings life, even though the path to life led through his own death. So I trust that as we've walked through this story this morning, that you've reflected on your own feelings, your own experiences, those times when you've been in despair, when you've cried out to God, when you have wondered, does God even care about me? Is God going to show up? Can you see the signs of his presence around about you? So this morning, let's let the truth of this story, with all of its ups and downs, realign our gaze. Where are we looking? To whom are we looking? God's going to show up. He's going to do his thing in his time. Where will we be looking? In our service this Sunday, we're going to be singing this song about the life of Jesus. And you can find it on our webpage just below the message here, and you might want to just listen to it as a reflective response to today's story. I trust this week as you walk with Jesus in your places, some with struggle, some with joy, God has shown up. He will show up. He is present with you this day, this week, as you walk with him. Lord, we be with you, friends. Have a good week. Take care.